My daughter's boyfriend kept asking about the mineral rights. Not once, not twice, but every single time he came out to the property. Connor would stand at the edge of the back field with his hands in his pockets, staring past the fence line toward the ridge where the old creek ran through, and he'd say something like, "So all of this is yours, Walter? Everything up to that tree line?" The first time, I figured he was just making conversation. The second time, I thought maybe he was genuinely curious about country living, being a city guy from Atlanta. By the fourth time, something in my chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since my engineering days, when I'd spot a stress fracture in a load-bearing beam and know, before I could even measure it, that something was wrong. My daughter Natalie would laugh it off. She'd squeeze his arm and say, "Connor's just fascinated by the land, Dad. He's never been around property like this." And she'd look at him the way she looked at him constantly in those days, like he was something rare she'd found and couldn't quite believe was hers. I'd spent 38 years as a structural engineer. I'd learned that when something keeps asking to bear more weight than it should, eventually it fails. Connor Walsh came into Natalie's life at a corporate retreat in Savannah. 32 years old, sharp dresser, worked as a wealth management consultant for a boutique firm in Atlanta called Meridian Capital Partners. He had the kind of handshake that was just firm enough, the kind of eye contact that said, "I'm listening to you specifically," and the kind of smile that made people feel like they'd said something more interesting than they actually had. He came home with Natalie for the 4th of July, 6 weeks after they'd started dating. I was civil. I asked questions. He answered them well. The property he kept staring at was 160 acres of ridgeland outside of Cookeville, Tennessee. Carol and I bought it in 1989 for what felt like a fortune at the time and turned out to be almost nothing. The land had timber, a creek with mineral rights attached, and about 12 acres of flat pasture we'd never done much with. Carol had grown up on a farm and always wanted land under her feet. We'd built the house ourselves over 3 summers, and our daughter had grown up running barefoot across those fields. Carol died 18 months ago. An aneurysm, the doctors said, here one evening gone by morning, the kind of loss that doesn't announce itself and doesn't apologize. Natalie came home for a month afterward, and we sat on the porch together most evenings, not saying much, just listening to the frogs down by the creek. She was the one who eventually said, out loud, that we needed to figure out what I was going to do with myself. I told her I already knew. I was going to stay right here. What Natalie didn't know, and what I had never found reason to explain, was what the property was actually worth now. Cookeville had been growing steadily for a decade, and in the past 3 years the growth had turned aggressive. Developers were buying ridgeland all along the county. I'd had 2 unsolicited offers in the past year, one for $2.8 million and one for $3.4. I turned them both down without much deliberation. This was Carol's land. Beyond the property, there were other things Natalie had no particular reason to know. During my career, I'd developed a method for calculating lateral load distribution in prefabricated steel frames that had eventually been patented and licensed to 4 manufacturing companies. It was unglamorous work that had paid me reliably for 22 years. Between the royalties, the investments I'd made quietly over decades, and the property value, I had total assets somewhere north of $7 million. I drove a 2014 pickup truck. I bought boots at the same farm supply store I'd been going to since 1993. I did not think about my net worth on a daily basis. Carol and I had decided early on that money was something you used to build a life, not something you displayed to prove you'd built one. Connor asked about the mineral rights for the 5th time in early September, standing at my kitchen counter while Natalie was in the shower. He said it casually, like he was continuing a conversation we'd already been having. Have you ever had those creek rights assessed professionally? Because if there's any extractable value there, you're probably sitting on more than you realize. I said I'd look into it. I kept my face the way I'd learned to keep it in 38 years of project meetings, which is to say, completely still. That evening, I called my attorney. Her name is Donna, and I had worked with her on property matters for 11 years. I told her I needed a background check on someone, gave her Connor's full name and employer, and asked her to be thorough. She asked me if this was about my daughter. I said it was a precaution. She didn't push back. 3 days later, she called and asked me to come to her office in person. She closed the door and sat down across from me with a folder on the table between us. She said that Connor Walsh was, on paper, exactly what he claimed to be. Licensed, employed at the firm he'd mentioned, no criminal record, clean credit. But her investigator had kept digging. She slid a second sheet across the table. Connor had been seriously involved with 2 other women in the past 4 years. The first was a woman named Stephanie Holloway, whose family owned commercial real estate in Charlotte. They dated for 7 months, and the relationship ended abruptly, 2 weeks after Connor had attended a family meeting about the Holloway estate. The second was a woman named Brooke Fanning, whose father had built a regional trucking company in Kentucky. That relationship lasted 5 months and ended shortly after Connor had been introduced to the family's accountant at a dinner Brooke's father hosted. Neither family had pressed legal charges. Donna said she had spoken to Stephanie's father informally, and he told her that Connor had tried to position himself as a financial advisor to the family before things fell apart. He hadn't been able to prove anything, so he'd paid quietly to make the situation disappear. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I asked Donna what she thought he was actually after. She said she thought he'd identified me as someone whose assets weren't protected by the kind of legal structures wealthy families typically have in place. No family trust, no corporate holdings around the property, just a man living alone on valuable land with a daughter who stood to inherit it. She said someone like Connor, if that's who he was, would move slowly. He'd get close. He'd make himself indispensable. He'd find a way to get access to financial decision-making, either through legal documents or through the kind of trust that builds up over years and is very hard to undo once it's in place. I thanked her and told her I needed a few days to think. She told me to call her whenever I was ready. Then she said quietly that I should consider telling Natalie. I told her I would, when the time was right. What I meant was when I had something more than a pattern of coincidences and the testimony of one man in Charlotte who hadn't pressed charges. I drove home and sat in the kitchen for a long time with the lights off. The frogs were going down by the creek. I thought about Carol. She had been a better judge of character than I was, faster and more instinctive. She would have known something was wrong with Connor before he ever asked his first question about the property line. I did not have her gift. I had something slower and more methodical, which was the ability to gather evidence until it became impossible to argue with. The following weekend, Connor came out again, this time to help me, he said, clear some brush along the western fence. He worked hard enough that I couldn't fault his effort, and while we worked, he brought the conversation around to estate planning. He said it in the most natural way imaginable, like it had just occurred to him. He said that as a wealth manager, he saw a lot of situations where families lost significant value because the older generation hadn't set up the right structures while they still could. He said he wasn't trying to overstep, but he felt like family, and he'd hate to see a situation where Natalie ended up in a complicated position. I said that was thoughtful of him. I said Carol and I had always meant to get around to it. He said he'd be happy to put together some materials, completely informal, just to give me a sense of options. He said things like qualified personal residence trusts and generation skipping provisions and stepped-up basis, and he watched my face the whole time he was talking, the way a person does when they're trying to gauge how much you understand. I told him I'd appreciate that. I kept my voice warm and a little tired, the way a man in his mid-60s who's been clearing brush all morning and doesn't understand financial instruments might sound. He left that afternoon, looking satisfied. I called Donna before his taillights were out of the driveway. I told her I needed surveillance. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she had a person she trusted, a private investigator named Ray, who had been doing this kind of work for 20 years. I told her to hire him. Ray was methodical and careful. Within 10 days, he had established Connor's patterns well enough to know where he went, who he met, and roughly when he had private phone conversations. The opportunity came on a Thursday afternoon when Connor had his car serviced at a dealership near his apartment. Ray managed to place an audio device in the vehicle during a routine inspection. He was very precise about what was and wasn't legal, and he told me clearly that the recording would be useful for making decisions but would be complicated in court. I told him I understood. On a Tuesday evening in October, Ray called me and said I needed to listen to something. He sent me a file. I sat in my study with the door closed and Carol's reading lamp on, and I listened to Connor's voice through my laptop speakers. He was talking to a man he called Grayson, I learned later that Grayson Merritt was a former colleague from a firm Connor had worked at before Meridian, someone who appeared to be involved in Connor's operations as a kind of silent partner. The recording was 18 minutes long, and I listened to all of it twice. Connor told Grayson that the situation in Tennessee was exactly what they'd been looking for. He said the old man was an engineer type, methodical, trusting once you got past the initial wariness. He said the daughter was easy because she wanted to believe the best about people, which was the most useful quality in the world if you knew how to use it. He said the property alone was worth between 3 and 4 million based on current comps, and that he had reason to believe there were additional assets, patents, or royalties of some kind that hadn't surfaced yet. He said he needed 2 more months to get in front of the financial picture completely, and then they could figure out the cleanest way to move things. Grayson asked what the plan was with the daughter. Connor said Natalie was the vehicle, not the destination. He said once they were married, he'd spend a year being the ideal son-in-law, building real trust with the father, getting named as a financial advisor or trustee in an informal capacity. He said old men living alone on large properties became risk-averse as they aged, and that risk aversion made them easy to steer toward the kind of asset restructuring that was difficult to undo. He said by the time anyone understood what had happened, the valuable parts of the estate would be in structures that gave him significant control. He said the marriage could last as long as it needed to, and not a day longer. Grayson laughed and said Connor was going to give himself a heart attack one day. Connor said the Fanning situation had been a near miss because the father had been smarter than he looked. He said this time he wasn't going to make the same mistake. He was going to be slower. He was going to be patient. He was going to get access to the mineral rights documentation and the full property deed before he pushed for anything, because once you understood the actual boundaries of what someone owned, you understood everything. I turned off the recording. I sat there for a while without moving. The frogs were down at the creek again. I had lived on this land for 31 years, and I knew every sound it made at night, and none of it had changed. And that was the strangest thing about a moment like this, that the world outside keeps sounding exactly as it always has, while something inside your understanding of things shifts permanently into a new position. I did not feel afraid. I felt something closer to the feeling I used to get on a job site when the structural calculations came back wrong, and I knew I had a limited amount of time before the error became catastrophic, clear-headed, focused, like every unnecessary thing had just fallen away. I called Donna in the morning. I told her what was on the recording. She was quiet for longer than usual, and then she said that what he'd described was criminal conspiracy, that the fraud elements were provable, and that she could have a conversation with the district attorney's office. I told her I wanted to move carefully. I told her I needed Connor to commit to something in front of witnesses, somewhere the evidence was airtight, somewhere Natalie would understand completely what had happened and not be able to wonder later if I had manipulated the situation. Donna asked me what I had in mind. My 65th birthday was in November. Natalie had been planning a party for 2 months. 30 people, catered dinner at the house. Connor was going to give a toast. She had been excited about it since August. Donna was quiet again. Then she said she understood what I was thinking and she needed me to listen to her very carefully about the legal strategy. We spent the next 3 weeks preparing. Donna brought in a colleague from Nashville who specialized in financial fraud. Ray installed cameras on the property with better coverage than the existing setup. 2 of my oldest friends, a man named Pete, who had retired from the county sheriff's department, and a woman named Gloria, who had been a criminal prosecutor for 24 years, were already on the guest list. I spoke to both of them separately and told them what I knew. Pete said he still had his credentials and knew the county sheriff personally. Gloria said she would bring a copy of Donna's evidence file and keep it in her car. I kept seeing Connor every couple of weeks. I played the part I had been playing, which was an aging man slowly warming to his daughter's future husband, occasionally asking questions about financial concepts that showed I was listening but didn't fully understand. Connor was visibly pleased with my progress. He brought printed materials to one of his visits, a folder of documents with Meridian Capital Partners letterhead, and walked me through what he called a basic estate modernization strategy. The documents included a durable power of attorney form and a proposed will amendment that would establish a family trust with Connor, named as co-trustee alongside Natalie. I told him I wanted to read through everything carefully before I signed anything. He said, of course, take all the time I needed, and he left the folder on my kitchen table. I photographed every page and sent it to Donna that evening. Natalie came home the week before the party to help get the house ready. She hung a banner across the porch that said 65, and somehow still standing, which made me laugh genuinely for the first time in a while. She cooked the same pot roast Carol used to make, her mother's recipe, the one that takes 4 hours and makes the whole house smell like Sunday afternoon. We ate together at the kitchen table, and she told me about a project she was working on, a landscape restoration effort she'd been brought in to consult on. And she was good at her work and passionate about it in a way that reminded me so much of her mother that I had to look out the window for a moment. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to reach across the table and say, "Natalie, the man you're planning to marry has been studying this house the same way a demolition engineer studies a building he's contracted to bring down." I wanted to say it had nothing to do with her judgment, and everything to do with the fact that Connor Walsh was a professional who had done this before and was very good at it. But I had watched Carol be the one who protected Natalie from things, and I had watched how Natalie had always needed to understand things herself, to hold them in her own hands before she believed them. If I told her now, she would defend him. She would look for alternative explanations. She would not be ready. I said I was doing okay. I said the land was looking good this fall. She said she was glad I was letting Connor help with the estate planning. She said it was a relief to know someone with his expertise was looking at things. I said it made sense to have family involved. She squeezed my hand across the table. The night before the party, Connor arrived from Atlanta and stayed at a motel in town rather than at the house, which was his custom. I had stopped by the guest room twice to check the ceiling camera Ray had mounted in the smoke detector housing. Not because I expected Connor to come into my study at night, but because I had learned from 38 years of engineering that you check everything before the load goes on. The morning of the party was clear and cold, the way Tennessee gets in November, that particular blue sky that looks like it's been stretched tight. I woke early and walked the perimeter of the property the way I had done every morning for 30 years. The creek was running well, the timber along the north ridge was healthy, the flat pasture was brown and quiet. I stood at the fence line where the mineral rights boundary ran, and I looked at it for a long time, and I thought about Carol buying this land when she was 34 years old, with money we had saved by eating dinner at home, every 4-3, night for 2 years. I thought about what it had meant to her. I thought about what I was going to do today and why, and I felt settled in a way I hadn't expected to feel. Guests began arriving at 4. Pete came early and I walked him through the layout of the house. Gloria arrived at 4:30 with her husband and the evidence file locked in her car. Donna's colleague from Nashville, a tall, quiet man named Thomas, came as a friend of the family, which he technically was, having helped me set up my current estate documents 8 years before. The county sheriff, a man named Dale who had known Pete for decades, arrived in plainclothes at 5 and introduced himself to the other guests as an old colleague of Pete's, which was also true. Natalie had done the decorations beautifully. She'd found photographs from every decade of my life and arranged them along the mantel, and there were ones of Carol in there that I had to take a breath looking at. Ones from when we were young, and still becoming whoever we were going to be. I stood at the mantel for a while, and then I moved on. Connor worked the room well. I watched him do it from across the living area, watched the way he moved from guest to guest with the right amount of attention for each one, remembered names, asked follow-up questions. He was very good at what he did. He came to me at one point and put a hand on my shoulder and said he was glad I'd let him be part of this, that he hoped I knew he thought of me as family already. I told him that meant a lot. I meant neither statement in the way he thought. Dinner was served at 6:30. 30 people around tables arranged in the living room and dining area, and the caterers moving quietly in the background. The food was good. The conversation moved the way it does, when people have known each other long enough to be comfortable. Connor sat beside Natalie across from me, and I watched them without appearing to watch them, which was something I had become extremely skilled at over the previous 2 months. Somewhere between the main course and dessert, Natalie excused herself to the restroom. She was gone for longer than I expected. When she came back, her face was composed, but I knew her face the way I knew this land, every contour of it, and something had shifted in the time she'd been away. She sat down and smiled at the conversation around her and did not look at me. Dessert came out. The conversation continued. Connor was talking to my friend Marcus, who had driven up from Chattanooga, about the Nashville housing market, and he was charming and authoritative and completely at ease. Then I felt a small folded piece of paper pressed into my palm under the table. Natalie's hand closed over mine for just a second, and then she was reaching for her wine glass. I held the paper in my lap and looked at Connor talking to Marcus. Then I unfolded it with one hand against my leg, her handwriting. 7 words. "Dad," I heard him on the phone. "Stop this." I looked at her. She was looking at her wine glass. Her jaw set the way Carol's jaw used to set, when she had made a decision she was certain of. Her hand was steady. She was frightened, and she was here anyway. I looked at Pete across the room. He looked back at me. I stood up. The table went quiet in the way tables do when someone stands at an unexpected moment. I said I wanted to say a few words, if people didn't mind, since this was my party, and nobody had thought to stop me yet. There was comfortable laughter. I let it settle. I said 65 was a strange age, that it made you think about things you'd put off thinking about. I said I had been doing a lot of that lately, partly because of losing Carol and partly because of everything that had happened in the past few months. I said I had made some decisions about the property and the estate that I wanted people to hear, since so many of the people in this room had been part of building this life with us. Connor was watching me with an expression of pleased attention. I said that I had spent the past 10 weeks learning something important, and that I wanted to thank the people who had helped me learn it. I looked at Donna, who gave me a slight nod. I looked at Thomas. I looked at Pete and Gloria. I looked at Dale standing against the wall in his plain clothes. Then I looked at Connor. I said that 2 months ago, I had hired a private investigator to look into the background of my daughter's boyfriend. I said what the investigator had found, the 2 previous relationships, the women from wealthy families, the pattern of access-seeking and abrupt departures. I kept my voice the way I'd kept it in 38 years of presenting structural findings, which was level and specific and without unnecessary emotion. Connor began to speak. He said my name with a kind of patient disappointment, the way someone does when they're managing a person who said something embarrassing. I said I wasn't finished. I said that I had subsequently obtained a recording, taken legally, of a conversation between Connor and a man named Grayson Merritt, in which Connor described, in specific terms, his plan to use my daughter as a vehicle for accessing my assets. I said he had used that word, vehicle. I looked at him when I said it, and I did not look away. The room had gone completely silent. Natalie was looking at him now. Connor's expression didn't collapse all at once. It changed the way a structure changes under load when it reaches its failure point, not dramatically but all at once, a kind of stillness replacing the performance. He looked at Natalie and said something about how this was a misunderstanding, that whatever recording I had was being taken out of context, that he had never said anything like what I was describing. Natalie said she had heard him on the phone 20 minutes ago in the parking lot. She said she had gone to her car to get the sweater she'd left there, and heard his voice through the window. She said she had heard him tell someone that the old man was ready to sign and that they just needed the birthday party to give it a sense of occasion. She said she had stood there in the parking lot in the dark and listened to the whole conversation and then came back inside. Her voice was completely steady. I watched her and felt something I didn't have a word for yet. Something between grief and pride that was entirely its own thing. Connor said that she hadn't understood what she'd heard. Pete stood up from his chair. Dale moved away from the wall. Gloria's husband touched her arm, and she was already reaching for her phone. Pete said he'd like everyone to remain where they were for a few minutes. Dale identified himself and told Connor he was being detained for questioning in connection with conspiracy to commit financial fraud. He said a formal warrant was being processed, and Connor would need to come with him. Connor looked around the room at 30 people. He had spent the past 2 hours charming, and his mouth opened, and he did not seem to know what to say. He said he wanted a lawyer. Dale said that was absolutely his right. Connor was led out through the front door. Through the window I watched the headlights of Dale's car pull down the gravel drive, and then the property was quiet again, in the way it always was. The creek running somewhere in the dark, the frogs that had gone silent during the commotion beginning again. The guests moved slowly, some staying and some leaving, many stopping to say something to me or to Natalie as they went. Gloria came and told me that Thomas had everything documented and that the DA's office would be in contact. Donna squeezed my arm and said she'd call me in the morning. Pete stayed until the caterers had cleared everything and then said goodnight with a long grip of my shoulder that didn't require any words. Eventually, it was just Natalie and me. She was sitting on the porch in Carol's old chair with a blanket around her, and I sat in the chair beside her, and we looked out at the fields going dark under a sky full of stars. Tennessee stars in November are something you don't forget. She said she felt like an idiot. I said she was not an idiot. I said she was someone who believed that people were who they presented themselves to be, and that was a quality I was not going to apologize for raising in her. I said Connor had done this before, that he had practiced on women from other families and learned from each attempt, and that by the time he found us, he was very good at being exactly what you wanted him to be. She said she should have seen it earlier. She said the questions about the property should have bothered her more. I said they had bothered me. I said that was the difference between 64 years of learning to pay attention and 27, and that the gap would close whether she wanted it to or not. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me how long I had known. I told her everything. I told her about Donna and the background check, about Ray and the surveillance, about the recording and the 3 weeks of preparation before the party. I told her about Pete and Gloria and Thomas and Dale, all of them sitting in the living room having cake while Connor walked around refilling wine glasses. She listened without interrupting, which was how she listened when something mattered. When I was done, she said, "You were going to do this even if I hadn't given you that note." I said yes. She said, "Why didn't you just tell me?" I said because I had asked myself that question every day for 2 months, and the answer I kept coming back to was that I could have shown her the recording and the evidence file and all of Donna's documentation, and she might have believed me, but she would always have held a small uncertainty about whether I had constructed something, whether my protectiveness had shaded into control. I said I needed her to arrive at her own conclusion. I said I was there to support it, not replace it. She didn't say anything for a long time. The frogs were loud by the creek. She said, "That's very annoying that you were right about that." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed completely in 2 months. She said, "Dad, how much is this property actually worth?" I told her. I told her about the offers, the comps, the current estimates. I told her about the patents and the royalties and what the investments had grown to over 30 years. I watched her face as the numbers registered. She said, "And you drive that truck?" I said the truck ran fine. She said, "Mom knew all of this?" I said Carol had known everything. I said we had talked about it many times, what we would do with it, how we thought about it. I said we had agreed that the money was a tool for building a life, not a score to keep, and that we had seen too many families poisoned by wealth that was displayed rather than used, inherited rather than understood. I said Carol had been very clear about what she wanted for Natalie. She had wanted her to be capable and grounded, and to know herself well enough that she could not be easily reduced to what she was worth to someone else. Natalie said, "She would have spotted Connor immediately, wouldn't she?" I said within the first visit. Probably the first evening. Natalie smiled a little at that. Carol had that gift and we both knew it. I said the property was already in a trust I had set up 6 years ago, properly structured with Donna's help, so that no spouse could access it without Natalie's explicit legal consent. I said the same structure covered the investment accounts. I said I had done it because I had watched Carol's sister's divorce and understood that the most loving thing I could do for my daughter's financial future was to make it structurally difficult for the wrong person to access it, regardless of whatever documents they had gotten signed. She said, "You've been thinking about this for years." I said I had been thinking about it since she was old enough to date. I said that was the thing about having a daughter, that you started worrying about certain problems before she did, and you couldn't always tell her why. She leaned her head back in Carol's chair and looked up at the sky. She said she missed her mother. I said I did too, every single day, in ways I was still discovering. She said, "What do we do now?" I said we did what we always did. We dealt with the practical things first, the legal process, the calls that needed to be made, the guests who deserved a proper follow-up. I said the DA would handle Connor and Grayson, that Thomas had already told me the evidence file was strong. I said it would take months, and not all of it would be comfortable. I said she would need to give a statement about what she'd heard in the parking lot, And I knew that would be hard, and I would go with her every time she had to do it. She said she could do that. I said I knew she could. We sat there for another hour without much more talking. At some point I went in and made 2 mugs of coffee and came back, and we watched the stars move the way they move when you sit still long enough to notice. The November cold was coming in properly now, the kind that settles into the hills by midnight and makes everything very quiet. Before she went inside, Natalie stopped at the door and said, "The sweater was actually just an excuse." I needed 5 minutes alone. I'd been watching him all through dinner, and something felt wrong, and I couldn't put words to it yet. She paused. When I heard him on the phone, the wrongness finally had a shape. I said that was how it usually worked, that the feeling came first and the understanding followed. She said, "Is that engineering or just being 64? I said, "Probably both." She went inside. I stayed on the porch a while longer. The creek was running well down in the dark. The timber along the north ridge was a black line against the sky. 160 acres that Carol had stood on in 1989 with mud on her boots and said, "Yes, this is the one. I want to grow something here." 30 years of growing something. A house, a life, a daughter who had just shown her mother's steadiness in the worst possible moment, who had walked back into a dinner party with a piece of paper in her hand and planted her feet. I thought about the note. 7 words, and what it had taken to write them. Not the certainty that she was right, the willingness to act before she was certain. The understanding that there are moments when you cannot wait for perfect knowledge, when you have to give the people who love you the chance to do what they came to do. Carol would have liked that note. She would have said that was exactly right. 6 weeks later, Connor Walsh was charged with conspiracy to commit financial fraud, 2 counts of attempted exploitation of a protected adult, and wire fraud related to his communications with Grayson Merritt. Grayson was charged separately. Both of them had lawyers who were very good at their jobs, and the process was exactly as slow and grinding as Gloria had warned me it would be. Natalie gave her statement twice. She did it both times without flinching, which surprised nobody who had known her mother. In January, Natalie moved back to the property for the winter. She said it was temporary, that she had a project starting in March back in Asheville. But I suspected she needed the land under her feet the way Carol had always needed it, the way some people need a place that knows them. She worked from the kitchen table most mornings, and in the afternoons she walked the perimeter the way I did, though she took different routes than I did and stopped in different places. I watched her from the window sometimes and thought about the way people carry their inheritance in the ways they move through the world, in what they stop to look at, in what they know without knowing they know it. In February we had a late snow, the kind that comes down heavy and covers everything in a single night. We walked out together in the morning, and the whole property was white and quiet, the creek still running dark through the white fields, and the ridge timber black against the white sky. Natalie had her mother's old wool coat on, the green one Carol had worn every winter for 20 years, and she walked out ahead of me toward the creek the way Carol used to do after a snow, that same long stride. I stood at the porch and watched her. She stopped at the fence line, at the place where the mineral rights boundary ran, and she looked up at the ridge for a long time. Then she looked back at me. She said, "It's ours, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, every acre of it." She turned back toward the ridge, and I watched her stand there in her mother's coat on her mother's land, and the creek ran through the white fields below her, and the sky was the same stretched blue it always was in winter, and I thought about what it meant to build something worth protecting, and what it meant to have someone worth protecting it for. Money can be lost and rebuilt and lost again. Land can be sold and bought and valued and devalued by forces that have nothing to do with the people who live on it. What cannot be replaced is the knowledge, held quietly between 2 people on a cold February morning, that the ones who tried to take something from you found nothing they could carry away, because what holds a family together is not in any document they could have gotten their hands on. I went inside and put the coffee on. The frogs were quiet under the snow. Spring would come, and they would be back. They always came back. That was the real value of staying.